This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so just to say thanks to everybody for coming today and joining us for today's Wednesday with Wing. So today's presentation is focused on management of induced seismicity. And as we all know, this is an incredibly important factor to the success of geothermal projects. And so it's fantastic to see that ARUP have been working closely on this. Thank you very much to Erin for helping arrange today's presentation. So today we have Michael. Michael, I apologise, I'm not sure how to correctly pronounce your last name, but it's great to have you here. If you'd like to introduce yourself in your presentation today.
Sure. Yep. Thanks very much. This is about 15-20 minutes. Is that how long these things usually go? Okay. So I'm going to talk about induced seismicity as it relates to geothermal, and mostly I'm going to focus on geothermal well stimulation. So the stimulation of wells rather than the long-term operation. This is work that ARUP does quite a bit of, and I'd also just like to, acknowledge Dr. Manuela Villani and Dr. Barbara Polidora, who work for ARUP, and they did a lot of the work that you'll see in the slides today. They are both very busy, and so that's why I've been left to give the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about ARUP and my background, why it's me giving this sort of talk. I'll talk a little bit about seismicity, and in the context of geothermal, I'll talk a little bit about what ARUP has done historically in this area, and the sort of three takeaway points I hope you sort of get and walk away with is that good geothermal areas typically go hand in hand with some level of seismic risk. Europe is more sensitive to seismicity, which is a little counterintuitive, as opposed to traditional ring of fire locations like Indonesia, New Zealand, places like that. The reason for that is population density and where these projects sit. The geothermal plants and wells are typically more closer to population centers in Europe than they are traditionally in places like Indonesia and the Philippines. And the last one, I said, probably the most important one, is seismic risk. It can be managed, but it can't really be controlled. I mean, we shouldn't be thinking that we're going around doing great work and we're controlling seismicity on geothermal projects, maybe because we've had a few success stories. It's something that has to be monitored and managed and carefully considered throughout the lifespan of a project, particularly where it's identified to be a risk for the project and for the surrounding community. So just a little bit about ARUP and my background. ARUP's been around since the mid 40s. It was founded by a guy named Ove ARUP, who was originally born in Denmark, but lived his entire life in the UK predominantly. The two things that he sort of created as a core ethos for ARUP is, this idea of shaping a better world and integrating a total design philosophy in the projects that we work on. Now we've got about 15,000 people working for ARUP all over the world. Our big flagship projects are like the Sydney Opera House and the Marina Sands in Singapore. We've done more than 150 geothermal projects. This probably includes ground energy projects as well. It almost certainly does, in 21 countries around the world. We do a wide range of services, and sometimes we have to use really smart people like Pete Lettingham, who's on the phone, to help us out when we're a little bit overextended. Myself personally, I am obviously not from the UK. I'm from the US, and I went to Virginia Tech for my undergraduate, and University of California in Riverside and Berkeley for my my master's, and I did research at Berkeley. I did most of my career in California before moving to ARUP, and now at ARUP I've been working almost 10 years, and I lead our sort of our global groundwater and geothermal engineering practices. I've got a long history in contaminated land as well, and that's sort of my experience. Some of the projects we've worked on, we've done seismic hazard assessments for the two big geothermal power projects in the UK, both in Cornwall, United Downs, and the Eden project. We've worked for Janssen Pharmaceutical, who has made the news recently as one of the vaccine producing companies. We've also been working in Scandinavia and doing seismic hazard work in Finland and Sweden. We do a lot of other types of work, you know, in the infrastructure arena in terms of tunnels and land contamination and just general groundwater engineering. I'll talk now about geothermal and seismicity. So everybody probably knows all of this stuff, but just to set the context, you know, geothermal needs two things to work. It needs heat, obviously, but it also needs flow and permeability. And as we all know, the water and the steam, this geothermal brine fluid, it moves through, typically it moves through breaks and discontinuities in the rock, so the fractures and the faults. And those fractures that conduct water in the ground, they can also move. And that's one of the reasons why earthquakes are linked to geothermal sites. So for seismicity, we've talked about geothermal, now seismicity, they need two things. They need conditions in the ground that'll actually move. So those are the faults. But they also need some sort of stress, some sort of push to actually make the seismic activity happen. That can be a natural event or it can be an induced event. And we're talking about geothermal activity here. So we're talking about induced events. And so that could be something like the pressure that you apply to a well. So that's during well stimulation when you're trying to improve the pressure regime in the reservoir and also improve the permeability in the formation in the near field around your well. And then in the long term, this could be injection of cool water, which is changing the pressure regime in the reservoir, and a long-term decline in pressure or pressure differential between the production wells and the reinjection wells. So we all know that, you know, geothermal is very closely linked with this ring of fire, and it's no surprise that this is also, you know, the seismic areas of the world. And that's, you know, if you didn't think there was a link between geothermal and seismicity, well, you just have to look at a map like this to be reminded. Talk a little bit about what's going on in terms of the physics of seismicity. The Moore diagram is a really useful tool to explain what's going on. And if you think of the rock as being a structure that is in a state of stress, both in its shear and in its normal state, so the forces that are being applied right to it, and then the shear forces, sort of like moving your hand back and forth against each other, those two interplay with each other. And the orientation of the fault, so the direction of the fault and how that relates to the stress field, is really important. So you can see these dashed lines here. That gives you an idea of the point at which a seismic event will occur. So when your fault stress field, when it crosses over the line, that's when seismic activity might happen. So that's just a very simple way of looking at it. You can see from this sort of Moore diagram type of classic way of looking at stress fields, your critically oriented faults will be more closely linked to the condition where the seismic activity will happen. And so once this thing crosses that line, you get a seismic event. So for existing faults, that line will be much closer to occurring, and for intact rock, it'll be further away. That's just sort of what the illustration looks like. So, you know, as you inject fluid into the ground, you may reduce the normal stress that's occurring, and that may get you to the point where a seismic event happens. But what's more interesting and what has to be considered in geothermal activities is that over time, the pressures that you've injected will redistribute within the porous matrix of the rock. And so what happens there is that the differential stress redistributes, and this relationship between shear and normal stress will change. And then over time, you can still get seismic events that occur even though you've stopped the injection, because of the redistribution changing the stress field to the point where a seismic event crosses this critical condition within the stress field. So what I'll talk a little bit about is, hey, injection happens, you get a seismic event, that's really clear. You stop the injection, the pore pressure is still changing within the matrix, and you still get earthquakes. And what we'll talk about a little bit is how bad that can make conditions. So this gives you a brief history of induced seismicity. The one on top is the big one, Pohang, South Korea in 2017, magnitude 5.5 event with lots of damage, big problem for the entire community, a real tragedy in terms of what happened. Other places you can see that, you've got places like Australia and Europe and the UK where there have been seismic events that have happened, and they've all generated different impacts as a result of the seismic event. So Cooper Basin in Basel in Australia and Basel, Switzerland, greater than 3 magnitudes. Both of them had a real negative impact on the geothermal industry. In Basel, it basically stopped geothermal. In Switzerland. In Australia, it was one of the things that really had a big impact on people's interest in geothermal. There was a lot of problems in Australia, not just this one event in Cooper Basin, but it certainly did not help the development of geothermal out there. Other places, much less seismicity. So you look at the recent projects like ST1 in Finland, which is a 6.5 kilometer deep geothermal well doublet for heat, and the United Downs Power Project. They have very active communication programs, seismic monitoring in place, to some extent lessons learned from all of these other sites above it, and the magnitudes have gone down. So there's been a real success story in these projects, but I think it would be a little arrogant to say that, oh, we've learned everything we need to know now and we can totally control seismicity. Obviously, when you have events on the order of 1.9 and 1.5, people are going to notice these things, and they're going to call their local seismic, they're going to call the BGS. In Finland, they called the Institute of Seismicity to let them know that, hey, some weird stuff is happening with the ground and noise. A little bit about Pohang, South Korea. So what was really interesting about this tragedy is that when they did their geologic prognosis, which is a critical aspect of any deep drilling campaign, they did not know about the presence of a fault at depth within the targeted reservoir that they were going to be working in. They had some anecdotal information about the presence of this fault, and that all gets into the he said, she said type of conversation. But if you look at it at a very high level, when they drilled into the ground, they encountered a fault, they intersected a fault, and as they stimulated, they got that fault to move, and that's what caused the big impact. The other thing that's interesting, and of course tragic at the same time, is as they operated their stimulation program, they were injecting fluids, they were getting events with certain magnitudes, and they realized that the frequency of these events were somewhat increasing, the intensity of the events were increasing, and so they made a decision to stop. And then when they stopped, they had the bigger event, the 5.5 event, and that really relates back to these mechanisms of induced seismicity and really setting your project up so that it doesn't put itself into a position where the redistribution of pressure is not going to lead to a bigger event that you can no longer control because there's nothing you can do about it. So that gets us into hazard assessment and risk. So, when we assess these seismic hazards, we have to look at it in the context of the natural seismicity seismic regime. We need to understand what is the project and what's going to happen out there. We need to monitor seismicity. We need to understand how the well is going to be stimulated and all of the design parameters for that. And we also need to know something about the long-term operation. We connect what happens in the ground in the natural seismic regime to what is felt at the surface with a ground motion prediction equation. And that is going to be a lot better off if it's based and well correlated to site-specific data. If not available, if you don't have the site-specific data, which is often the case because you're out there drilling and you haven't really gotten a lot of data to utilize, then you're basing it on, you know, the experience of all these projects where data is available. And you can imagine that even when you're trying to focus in on maybe a similar geology, like for example, we did a project recently in Sweden. So we're weighting our assessment towards the geologies that are similar, such as in the granite in the UK and in Finland. You can imagine that you're going to come up with some conservative results, which is good, particularly if you haven't done anything out there yet. You want to be conservative, and you know, seismic engineers are some of the most conservative folks in our industry, in geoengineering, and that's because of the significant impacts that can happen, and nobody wants to put themselves in a position like the tragedies that have happened in Pohang. So then we can quantify the risk during stimulation. I'll show a couple of slides about that. And really the other point is, how does maybe what happens during stimulation impact what happens in a very long period of time? So we need to make some qualitative assessment for seismic risk in the long term. And the reason why this becomes a qualitative endeavor at this point in the project, because there's not a lot of existing site data. We don't know how the wells interact with the ground yet. We gain information and knowledge from well stimulation, but a lot of the methods that we use to evaluate risk during stimulation really can't be applied for very long-term operations. Communication is really the key of any of these types of projects and any of these activities within this project. Everybody knows seismicity comes with a lot of jargon. These are based on non-deterministic methods to look at things. So we're not even coming up with a number here. We're coming up with a distribution function. So it's highly dependent on statistics. And so we need to convert these things over so that people can understand exactly what this risk is. And so we use terms that we think people can really relate to, like, if I tell you it's expected, you know it's going to happen. If I tell you it's likely going to happen, you know that, okay, this thing may be possible here. It's probably going to happen. So that means we need to plan for it happening. And then if it's possible, then we definitely need to consider it, and we need to have mitigation measures that are attached to what the impact might be if it actually happens. Then we looked at things like unlikely and very unlikely. Well, very unlikely is very easy because it's theoretically possible, but it's not going to happen. We know it's not going to happen. On paper, it's possible, just as from a calculated a calculation exercise, but we're really going to ignore that at that point. Unlikely, if we're looking at a probability of say 1 to 5%, well, in a month, maybe 5%, you can tolerate that and not really come up with a plan to deal with it, depending on how much of an impact we're talking about. But over 30 years or 50 years, the probability at 5% starts to take on a little bit more meaning. So you also have to look into the context of not just its likelihood, but also the impact in the context of the problem you're looking at. So that gets us into what is the actual risk. It's not just based on the likelihood, but it's also based on the impact. And then we usually generate some scoring system that everybody can agree to. And we try to simplify it as much as possible so that non-technical people can interact and understand, and developers that are not seismic or geologic folks can be able to take ownership of what the ramifications of this type of project is going to mean for them and for their company. And we'll talk about the impacts at surface, but at a very high level, we're talking about no impact, everything's fine, everybody's happy. Human perception, so we feel it, we might complain about it might wake us up in the middle of the night, but we're talking about something that on a social scale, we're talking about green energy and providing baseload renewable energy sources. So it's more likely that even being able to experience an earthquake is going to be acceptable to a community. Then we talk about things like cosmetic and structural damage. Obviously, structural damage is not going to be acceptable. And then cosmetic damage is very likely not going to be acceptable either. So from a risk perspective, we're trying to stay in this section over here, which is only human perception and trying to manage these risks so we never get into a situation where we're at a sort of plates falling off the wall and a crack in the wall that's not a structural crack sort of situation. So that's the line in the sand that we draw, and we try to draw it very hard to stay on this side of the project. So likelihood, how likely will there be earthquakes? Well, we do a bunch of calculations. We calculate the probability of natural events, and then for a well stimulation project, we calculate the incremental probability that the stimulation will induce seismic events. And then we characterize this back into our little agreed non-technical words. So, 100% likely of a magnitude 1 or greater is expected, but it's only possible that it will be magnitude 2 or greater. So we can use this likelihood terminology to figure out how to really address the risks. And that takes us to the next part, is what's going to be the impact. And so that really relates to this ground motion prediction equation and the relationship between a seismic event and how it's experienced at the ground surface. And so these things can be defined as peak ground velocities, peak ground accelerations. Typically, we like to rely on peak ground velocities. They're a little bit better for monitoring for various reasons, while PGAs are used a lot in design, and you see them in building codes. But then, just like I said, we create, this is from a guy, Dr. Julian Balmer, created this odometer to talk about induced seismic risks from geologic activities. And so you can see that, we create thresholds in terms of peak ground velocities, and we relate these things to sort of weak structures. So structures that, without doing a very detailed assessment of the structural impacts out in the community, we can say that these are reasonably conservative peak ground velocities. One of the things that we found on the projects we've worked on is the threshold of human perception is is not conservative enough here. So 1 millimeter per second, I think originally it might have been 2 millimeters per second. We know that people are experiencing deep seismic events related to well stimulation, like our projects in Finland and in Cornwall, at much lower PGVs than what had been traditionally expected. Sometimes they experience it as a rumble or the glass shaking on their window, or they just hear it. A lot of times we heard in Finland people complaining that it sounded like an airplane flying under the ground, which is pretty interesting. So like I said, we relate this all back to the risk. And here's an example, some of the outputs we come up with. So when we talk about risk, we have to mesh the impact with the likelihood. And so for this project, this is a typo, that should be a magnitude 2. There was an expected magnitude of 1 or greater. Possible events were magnitude 2 or greater. So we're definitely planning for these types of events up here. Magnitudes 3 and 4 were both considered to be very unlikely. Because they're very unlikely, we don't really need to consider them. And if you can see on this color coding, as a distance away from where the seismic event occurred, you can see that for an expected event of magnitude 1, we expect, it may be that some people experience the event, but for the most part, we're in the green. And as we get right away from the site, it's much less likely that people would experience the event. For a possible event, people are, we're pretty sure that people are going to experience the event. So for this stimulation event, it was going to last for a month and a half. We thought we might get a magnitude 2 type of condition where people would definitely experience things. But because these types of events at magnitude 3 and greater are very unlikely, then we don't think we would be in a problem where we would see these things. Of course, the way these plots are shown, it begs the question of what's the difference between magnitude 2, which is possible, and magnitude 3, which is very unlikely. And our curve goes from somewhere from being, into the cosmetic damage is possible, sort of event. And that brings it back to, okay, now we need to manage risk out at the site, and we need to monitor seismic activity. So now we need to talk about monitoring and management of seismic activity, because we never want to get into a situation where above magnitude 2 and our line starts to move into a point where cosmetic damage is possible in buildings nearby. So we develop a traffic light system. Now, we've typically taken a view that from a regulatory perspective and engaging with the community, it's better to have a very simple to understand traffic light system. So ambers means be careful and red means stop. And we link these to both surface instruments that are measuring ground vibrations and also seismic events at depth. And so basically, we do this so that we have a higher level of assurance that when something is detected at the surface, it can be actually linked to a seismic event. And then also we can develop a better set of data that links the seismic event to what's happening at the surface. Then we can improve the ground motion prediction equation. And then for long-term forecasting, we can start to reduce the level of error in the forecasting that's possible. So until we start to develop that data, which only happens when seismic events occur, can we ever develop a stronger site-specific equation. The other thing is, it's really important, obviously, to measure seismicity in the ground, because a real heavy truck could drive by and cause a ground disturbance that would trigger an event. So you really want to make sure you can take out those false positives from surface monitoring equipment. Finally, I'm basically at the end of the talk here. It's just very little bit about management of induced seismicity. We published a paper in Science Advances last year, and 2019 now, and this was related to our work in Finland. And the paper was called Controlling Induced Seismicity During Well Stimulation. And I argued a lot with the authors about that, and I lost the argument because I really believe we didn't control anything out there. We managed it and we got lucky. We just don't really know enough about the relationship between putting fluids in the ground, letting those fluids dissipate in terms of their pressure, and being able to re-stimulate wells to say that we can control seismicity out there. There's a lot of relationships that exist that help you look at this phenomena anyway. And all of the information that you can possibly lay on the table, which is what we did in this project in Finland, you have to do. You look at the cloud of data, you look at the frequency of events, you look at where they are located spatially relative to what you know about the structure and the geology. You look at everything you know, and then you can make some informed decisions about how to proceed. Really what it comes down to is you will have a relationship like a Van der Elst or a Megar, a Gallus relationship that you believe is most appropriate for your geologic system and your well stimulation activity. And then you will just try to keep on the small side of that curve, because if you stay on the small side of that curve, you're able to follow a trajectory in terms of being able to manage your project below whatever your safe levels are based on your risk assessment. So that's it. That's the whirlwind tour of the work that ARUP does in the world of induced seismicity and geothermal. So the last thing I always like to leave with the walkaway point. So good geothermal areas go hand in hand with seismic risk. Europe is definitely more sensitive to seismicity. That's what we see in projects that we work on globally. A lot of this is related to how close the population is to the wells and the plant. And the last one, the most important thing I think, is that seismic risk, it's been successfully managed. So I think we can say it is manageable, but you can't really control it. And while the projects I've been involved with personally have gone well, that's not to say that I won't get lucky on the next one. And we're still learning and collecting information. So that's it. I'm happy to take all the questions or anything you guys want to talk about as well.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that talk. It was excellent. And thank you, Maddie, for introducing it. Apologies, I missed the start. I was called up from a COVID jab. But no, that was really, really enlightening. And it's that age-old thing of, is there a seismic area that exists, or is it just an area without a seismometer? I think I learned that one from Pete. Does anyone have any questions on that? Go on, Pete. You got your hand up.
All right, thank you. Very interesting, Michael. Thanks very much. You've obviously now looked at a whole load of data, predictive data, and then for projects that have gone into operation. How do you feel about this rule of thumb that's crept into the technology, that if you get a seismic event and then stop, you're going to get another one an order of magnitude bigger? That's found its way even into some of the regulations. Do you believe that? Do you think that's a good approximation?
I think there's two parts to that story, and there's one is, as you said, it's a rule of thumb, right? So it's something that regulators can attach themselves to in a world that they don't understand, so that they can feel like they have some control over their ability to regulate this type of work. So I think they're being incredibly cautious with that. But I don't think we have, a huge amount of paperwork to say you're not being, that you're being overcautious. I think the work, what happened in Pohang is a really good example about this. And, that's what happened. They're in the sort of magnitude 2, they, magnitude 3s, and then all of a sudden they've got a magnitude 5 out there. Now, South Korea is a seismically active area. They have real earthquakes. When my wife felt her first earthquake in San Francisco, we used to live in San Francisco, it was like a magnitude 3, and she jumped up. She's German, and she jumped up and ran to the bedroom to start packing. I'm like, "Where are you going? This is not an earthquake. It's just a magnitude 3." But that community is, we don't mind magnitude 3s. That's normal for people that live in places like South Korea and San Francisco. In places like Basel, Switzerland, it's a completely different ballgame, obviously. I think it really relates to the geology. I think it really relates to things that we may never really know about, how the pressure waves will redistribute as a function of how it's been applied into the ground. I think there's a lot there. You could probably say there's a lot of chaos theory going on in the way these pressure fronts move, and they're very highly dependent on the manner at which they were injected into the ground, and all of the little things that are going on as that pressure wave moves into the ground that's never been really changed in a like a geologic period of time. So long story short, I don't think it's accurate to say it's going to be an order of magnitude greater after you've shut in your well. I don't think there's good data to say that that's the case, but I can understand a regulator's concern about the ramifications if it is one of those bad situations.
Okay, thanks.
Michael, can I also add something?
By the way, this is Dr. Barbara. I didn't think she was going to be available to do this, but she is on the call.
No, thank God that the nursery was open today. So, non chiedetto.
She's in Italy, so slightly different situation than the UK.
Yeah, no, just wanted to add something on this. We also need to say that there is during the diffusion of the during the whole process, there is also an interaction between the different faults. So you can never discard the hypothesis that because on a fault you triggered an event, this is going to trigger additional events on closer faults that could be bigger of the previous ones. So this is the reason, one of the reasons why you can't discard the fact that you can have a higher magnitude.
I think we just don't know
Earthquakes
enough.
happen in clusters, so it's just at the end of the cluster that you really can identify the biggest one, and this also happens in the natural tectonic, in the natural seismicity. So it's the same kind of process.
Yeah, it's the same process. It's sort of accelerated by the fact that you're injecting fluids.
Yeah.
So you create like a little mini experiment of your natural system. But the way these things relate, nobody really knows how they relate to begin with. And then you're dealing with all the site-specific conditions of this reservoir. It's just really hard to say that that's not a reasonable rule of thumb. It would be really hard to argue that that's not an appropriate rule of thumb, I guess.
Thank you. And Dave, did you have a question?
Yeah, please, David at Town Rock Energy. Thanks for the talk, Michael. And also, just before I ask my question, I want to say, congratulations on the policy document that you've helped prepare at ARUP for the UK government, which I've had a little pre-read of and looks really good. So I'm going to be happy to support it.
We hope we don't get many comments at this point.
Yeah, I thought about giving you my comments, and I thought, no, it looks like a pretty finished piece of work, and there's nothing that I can particularly criticize.
Critical changes are the editorial stuff is we just don't have a lot of time left on it.
Yeah, and that's pretty important. It gets out to the government right now as well. I think we don't want to cause any delay. So no, really nice document. So looking forward for it to be sort of publicly available. Yeah, so it was one of the case studies you mentioned was Basel in Switzerland, which, as we all know, was detrimental to the Swiss geothermal sector for a good decade or so. It was only that, so my understanding of what happened there was actually that they hit a pocket of gas that was in a fault, and the gas kind of ignited, and that triggered the earthquake. It wasn't actually injected fluids that triggered the earthquake. And I wondered if you could correct me there, or if this actually was a slightly different scenario than the other ones, which were triggered by fluid injection.
Okay, so first of all, I haven't heard that one about Basel. I mean, we worked with a couple of different folks that were involved with that project, the monitoring company and the guys that did some of the work for the government. I haven't heard that, but that doesn't mean it's not the case. Does anybody else know more about that? I always thought it was during the stimulation.
I've just seen a comment from Nick Shaw. Would you like to expand on that? He says it was St. Gallen with the gas.
So there was a project at St. Gallen which was stopped because of seismicity, because of a gas kick as well. My knowledge on Basel was, I mean, the basic problem was they injected into not an antithetic fault of the Rheingraben, they injected into one of the main faults. And a number of people, including myself, advised them against having a well design, into the main boundary fault. And I think fundamentally, it was not a surprise. Unfortunately, the damage continues to impede geothermal in Switzerland, and in particular into the canton of Jura, and also Aargau. So, Marcus Haring used to work with me when I was in Shell, and he was in court. I had a question about the Pohang disaster. You said it was a 5.5 and it was a disaster. What was it? I wasn't aware. I've heard lots about it, but not about the damage or actually.
There was definitely lots of building damage as a result of the earthquake. I haven't read the paper in a while. I should have read it a little bit more when I was preparing these slides. There's a lot of stuff on. Yeah, if somebody else knows that's fine.
I understand there was actually one recorded death as a result as well, which was a real tragedy. And I understand as well that the company involved have basically had all of their assets frozen immediately afterward and have been taken to court by the South Korean government and could be facing quite extensive jail time as a result of their decisions. It's a very, very serious issue. I guess yeah, sorry, go ahead, Nick.
I was going to ask a question about a lot of stuff to do with stimulation, or fracking. Certainly in fracking is to do with the pump rates and volumes and so on, which impacts the way the stuff diffuses, and also on the ratio of the principal stresses at the place where you're doing the injection. For instance, in the Habanero project, from day one they were making pancake fractures, jacking up the overburden, and there were a lot of other reasons why that project would fail, basically because of the state of stress at that part of the Eromanga Basin, irrespective of the seismicity, I think. So I think it's I'm interested to see if how this relates to the problems of companies like Quadrilla, or there are projects in the Netherlands which have been shut in because of seismicity. The California project in Limburg, for instance, which is a very important project for the Carboniferous limestone in the Netherlands and Belgium. Have you looked at those sort of lower temperature type stimulations?
Yeah, we did a lot of work with Quadrilla when they were very actively trying to develop their plays in the UK. So we did a lot of Pete and I worked together on that one, actually. It's very different sort of stimulation activity. Typically with these sort of geothermal projects, they're not using proppants. The pressures are much less. The flow back is completely different. So at scale, I mean, obviously Quadrilla is not a very good example. They never got to scale, but at scale, we're talking about a handful of wells for geothermal project versus many wells for shale gas operation. So the scale of the risk and the potential for problems, it's sort of night and day. Yeah, from that perspective, that's the sort of scale of risk is quite different. There's also what they add into the additives, and is it going to get to the aquifer or not to the aquifer, and the well integrity comes into play at that point also. So there's a lot of different moving parts, I think. I do know that for some well stimulation designs, I see developers starting to think about improving the rheology of the fluid they're using to try to reduce the cost of or to improve the value of the injection events. In Scandinavia, they've got very hard rock up there. They would love to use geothermal to develop heat production. It's very the return on the investment is incredibly low for something like that. The project in Finland is 6.5 kilometers. They did a very simple stimulation of water and pressure application. They're looking at other projects, and other developers are looking projects like in Scandinavia, and so they're really trying to see how they can improve what they get out of the stimulation. So they also are trying to manage the seismicity too. So they're not trying to apply greater pressure, but they are trying to see how they can maybe keep the fractures open. Maybe they'll look at proppants. It's just really hard to say how they're going to deal with that. They're really in the developmental stage right now. I don't know if that answered your question that well. We look at, we've obviously looked a lot in Netherlands. My company, ARUP's, looked a lot in terms of the seismicity that's occurred in the northern Netherlands as a result of long-term gas extraction. And we've also done work around the world that's related to induced seismicity from salt caverns as well. So we do look at a variety of different aspects of it.
I've got a slight follow-on question, I guess, from David and Nick, in that it's really I didn't know you had put a document together for the UK government, and I think that's essential, especially if we're moving forward as an industry as a whole. It's really great to have these guidelines in early so that everyone can follow and we have some consistency. Do you have a feel for how they're going to react, given the sort of reaction to the fracking limits and that sort of thing? And is there any is there any talk about how to engage the public with it and that sort of thing?
Well, okay, so I think we have to be very careful. It's a very different scale between what the shale gas industry was intending in terms of what they wanted to do with the ground versus what a geothermal developer is trying to do.
Yeah.
The scale of it is very different. Luckily, I think Cornwall has been the sort of springboard for geothermal in the UK rather than Lancashire. In Cornwall, they have a real heavy history of mining and ground movements related to the mining industry, and they've been very excited about geothermal for a very long time. Like I said, Pete's been very involved, and his company has been involved since the 80s out in Cornwall. And so the success of the projects like United Downs and hopefully Eden as well will hopefully carry a long way into what can be possible in geothermal for the UK, and start to take the conversation away from fracking and what the shale gas interest in ground engineering was versus what the real impacts are in terms of a geothermal project, which is, okay, we don't have the environmental footprint of a shale gas project. We're not talking about all of the crazy things in terms of the volumes of generated norm, the volumes of brine that's saline rich that has to be disposed of from all the flow back from shale gas type projects. We're talking about putting some wells in the ground. They will have norm, they will have some water to dispose of, but the volumes are orders of magnitude different from a shale gas project. And we will have seismicity to manage as well, and the seismic regime and the seismic risk will be different throughout the UK, because like I said before, it sort of goes hand in hand with the orientation of the fractures and the permeabilities that exist at depth and how deep we're going. Those wells at United Downs, 5 some kilometers deep. If we're talking about heat wells, which most of the geothermal opportunity in the UK is related to the production of heat, we're probably talking about much shallower wells that are closer to the surface and will have a different sort of seismic risk associated with that as well. So from the technical part of the story, that has to go with people that have the experience of managing those sort of risks and able to communicate it to wide stakeholders so that the community understands what's happening and there's a good transparency about it. The work that those guys did, Pete did down in Cornwall with putting seismic monitors in schools and communicating with children and in schools, is really effective in educating the overall community about the reality of the geothermal project and how that may relate and be very different from what happens in a shale gas project and those sort of activities.
So
the
as
other
we,
side, yeah,
oh, I was going to say, so as we scale up, would it be do you see it as a project by project basis, or if it's a sort of a governmental document, something that they will promote as well, but in a more positive way?
The big problem is not the seismic risk or the environmental risk. The big problem is it is really expensive to drill these holes in the ground. And we don't know how much energy is going to come out of the ground. And so, they started doing their tests at Rose Minnows in Cornwall in the 80s. And here it is 2021, and there's 2 holes in the ground in Cornwall to produce power. That's a pretty long lead time to get to the point of being able to produce electricity. So the work that the Renewable Energy Association came to us and said, hey, you're sort of mid-sized British consultancy, it might be useful to have a report come from you guys, and you sort of try to take an independent stance on the work that you do. But I mean, it really comes down to, look, what's the opportunity for geothermal? You know, there's a huge heat demand in the UK. I mean, it's May, and one of you said it's snowing in Glasgow. You know, it's a little bit ridiculous how much the heat demand is. Geothermal can produce heat. It's very expensive to do it. There's a lot of uncertainty for developers. It's just the real, but it's low carbon. It checks a lot of boxes in terms of, hey, this is a great thing for a government to get in and push and kickstart. Otherwise, it's just not going to do it on its own if you leave it to the market. So they did it for you know, ground source heat pumps and biomass and the renewable heat incentive. That's being phased out, or it's phased out already pretty much. You know, biomass was a real beneficiary to that. Ground source heat pumps, not so much. So if the government, if geothermal is going to work in the UK, it's going to need government support. And that's what's happened in Germany. That's what happened in Indonesia. That's what happened in the United States. That's what happened in the Netherlands as well. And, you know, those guys are chugging along with geothermal plants and projects. And so if the UK is, you know, wow, who knows what the government wants to do or is going to do, but there's a real solid argument that if they want this to be part of their solution for reducing carbon, then they're going to have to do something to support it.
Yeah, of course. We're all backing that in this group. Yes, another question.
I've got a question if no one else has.
Yeah, go ahead, Helen.
Yeah. So I mean, there's lots of talk about monitoring induced seismicity, and quite rightly so. But I'm actually really curious and interested in the importance of understanding the natural state and the development and use applicability of pre-development baseline surveys, not just in seismicity, but right across the board. And if I can quickly put that into context, the geology is very different. But I work in East Africa, and they don't do any kind of baselines. And this, one of the sites that I work at that actually Dave is familiar with, if he's not dropped off, oh no, he's there. Dave Townsend is also very familiar with in Kenya, Menengai. And not during reservoir stimulation, but actually during drilling, they induced some minor seismicity. But they weren't able to identify, well, I say they induced, they weren't able to answer whether it was induced seismicity, whether it was a change in hydrostatic pressure that caused the seismicity, or whether it was related to volcanic tremors. When I asked them, you know, how can you tell the difference? They were just like, well, we have no baselines, we don't know. But with the drilling rock cuttings that came out of the well at the time, they had actually intercepted some liquid magma that had solidified straight away into obsidian with a sort of thermal shock. And so, yeah, I'm really interested in what your thoughts are on understanding natural state and what its role is in forecasting what might happen as we develop a site.
Well, I think a couple of things on that. First of all, if a seismic event happens in your little volume, that's your radius of influence, you just bought yourself a seismic event, whether it's natural or induced. It's really hard to get, you know, you can have all the conversations with technical folks in the world about it, but you're never going to convince the public it wasn't you, you know? So that has to be taken on within the context of your own risk that you're signing up to for a project. You know, in the UK, it's not a big deal, right? You're probably not going to have a seismic event that's going to kill your project that's naturally occurring. You know, the scale we're talking about is very different in the Rift Valley of Ethiopia and Kenya and places like that. You may very well. We have a project we're working on in Ethiopia, and you know, a lot of the traditional in the traditional geothermal plays, they don't have the sensitivity about seismicity from the local communities that we see that has occurred in Europe. So I think there's a real, for once, I think that places like the UK and Germany and the Netherlands can provide some real value to the global geothermal community about how to manage and communicate seismic risk, which, we don't always get to have some knowledge about related to folks in New Zealand, and Iceland. I think the other, I was just gonna say, you had one other point too. I can't remember what it was.
It was just what the role is of sort of how important, and the role of understanding the natural state. What is its role going forward in sort of monitoring and mitigating and communicating the potential of induced seismicity?
Yeah, it's like that for anything though, right? If you don't have baseline data, something happens, there's nothing to base it against. That's why it's called baseline data.
No, I know. I'm trying to convince the Kenyans of this, and they're they're not having it at the moment.
It's really easy to convince them if you have a investor like an African Development Bank or something like that you're the technical advisor for, because then they're just going to withhold the paycheck, I know. I
mean, the company I'm working with is actually Geothermal Development Company, so they're a subsidiary of the government.
Well, but that's a very different, that's a very different endeavor there. They're sort of, and they're a great drilling. They're a great. They've got a lot of success and track history. They've done things their way for a very long time, but they don't have a. There's no pressure for them to spend that money on that sort of work.
And just one more thing, Ellen. This is also the reason why in all the risk assessment and hazard assessment we perform, we always consider as maximum magnitude the ones that can come from a tectonic event. So in all our studies, we always consider both induced and natural events, for what Michael said, because you can't really distinguish, or you can't convince anyone that one event will be induced. In the risk, you need to account for both of them. And this is the reason why usually our threshold seems higher than the magnitude of induced event. The reason is exactly this one, to include also the possibility of having a tectonic event in the volume of interest.
I think for Pohang, the developer argued that it was a natural event, and I think they sort of got away with that for a little bit of time.
In Pohang, what they say is basically that they were basically there was already a fault that was pre-stressed, so it was already close to generate an event, and the stimulation basically just accelerated that process. Because on a fault, you accumulate stress until you reach a threshold and the earthquake occurs. They didn't know about that existing fault, and they were basically stimulating in the area of that fault. So basically they accelerated the process of reaching the threshold to generate the event.
Yep.
Yes, Pete.
And that's a really serious problem for geothermal developers, because if you are doing a seismic risk assessment ahead of a project or in the planning phase of the project, it's all the stuff that Michael covered. It's very difficult to answer the question that somebody might ask you, well, can you see that, never mind all the induced stuff around your wells, can you guarantee you're not going to trigger a tectonic event in a fault you don't know is there?
You can't.
That question, you can't answer that question. It's impossible.
No, exactly. It's impossible. But this is exactly the reason why for selecting the possible magnitude, you look at probabilistic seismic hazard that are based on tectonic event. So you base your calculation also on the historical tectonic ones, and you should include in your calculation. You can't just rely on what you think you will induce so not considering the possibility of existing faults. And also what Michael said, this is the reason why it's super important to always perform a very good tectonic, to have a tectonic knowledge of the area, because this can help a lot.
Yeah.
Where did, as a matter of interest, where did a 5.5 fit into the natural seismicity picture in Pohang? Is that a big one, a small one?
I don't know off the top of my head.
I think a 5.5 is commas fairly normal for the region, but there just hadn't been any significant events along the specific fault that they ruptured, and it was a strike slip fault. I can't remember which direction, but it was a strike slip fault as opposed to like normal or reverse as well. So steep, quite steeply dipping. But yeah, I mean, regionally, I think the strength it was fairly close to normal. It just hadn't been that strong for quite a considerable amount of time.
Yeah, it was almost a 10-kilometer length fault. So it was basically, I mean, for that kind of fault, a 5.5 is expected. The problem is that they didn't know about that fault.
There's also a paper out that actually sent to Sabine after her talk a couple of weeks ago about a lot about the Pohang earthquake and the relationship between silica precipitation along that fault and the locking up of that fault, and then the releasing of that strain buildup, and what the role silica's had on it as well. It's quite an interesting paper.
Okay, and aware of time, and thank you everyone for coming. Maddie, is there anything that you would like to add in? Have I missed anything?
No, I think that's all from me. Thank you very much, Michael. It was a fantastic talk. Really interesting.
No, thanks a lot. It was really nice to be here, and the conversation was great. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much to ARUP for preparing that, and Michael for giving that presentation. Our next Wednesday with Wing is a bit different. It's aimed at the student population. We're going to do a careers event. So if any of you have links to universities and that sort of thing, we're going to try and advertise it next week and get as many people to sign up as possible, just to try and promote geothermal in the UK and what careers you can go into, because it's an ever evolving industry, which is great. Okay.
Yep. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.